Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, what I've learned from Plot Hooks adventures. In the Wilds, the Crawling Claw. And in the Tavern, what would you do if you were beset by pirates? Well, hey there, everybody. Hope everyone out there is having an excellent day. Excited to be back here recording for our flagship show about what I've learned from our second show, Plot Hooks Adventures. Coming up later this week is the final episode in the second session that we've run on that particular new program. And I thought it would be a great time for us to look at the things that I've learned throughout this process and how I've grown as a DM. Before we get into that, though, just a few announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can find us at PlotHooks on all of those platforms. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube if you'd like to listen to the podcast that way. Remember on Twitter, we have our quest for 1K going on, and we're only about 80 followers from the next giveaway, which happens whenever we hit 700. We'll be giving away to a lucky follower a great package from Games by B, Arcane Spectacles, and Greenleaf Geek. However you listen to the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you'd give us a rating and a review. It helps more people find out about the show. And it would be also awesome of you if you could support us on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there for our patrons, especially homebrew information, as well as being able to impact the show and impact Plot Hooks Adventures, which we'll be talking about here in a little bit. And we also have to shout out a brand new patron. Luna, thanks so much for joining the Patreon. And thank you all out there who support us on Patreon or just support us via listening to the podcast. We're so thankful for every member of the Plot Hooks family, and we genuinely appreciate your support. Well, with that out of the way, let's dive into the prime material. What I've learned from Plot Hooks Adventures. If you aren't aware, Plot Hooks Adventures is our second show, a show that brings together content creators from other streams, podcasts, or other locations, as well as other members of the Plot Hooks team and our patrons, and brings them all together for one shot set in our official Plot Hooks world of Carrick. We've done one full session, which was released over 3 episodes, and coming up this week, our second session will conclude with part 4 on Wednesday. We already have the third session recorded, and that will start in early October. And let me tell you, this has been an amazing experience. I have absolutely loved DMing for so many unique and creative people that I haven't had a chance to interact with in an actual gameplay setting. I might have talked to them before and, of course, interacted online, but to actually sit down and play Dungeons & Dragons with them has been amazing. And to be honest, this was my first time being a Dungeon Master or Game Master for folks that were not in my friend group. I've never had the time for Adventure League or other events at my local game store. Speaking of which, Gamers, Geekery, and Tavern in Cary, North Carolina is where I play, and it is amazing. And if you're ever in the area, please stop by. It's the best LGS I've ever attended. Gamers, Geekery, and Tavern in Cary, North Carolina. Unsolicited plug for that great store. But yeah, I've never had any time for those type of things. I've only ever DM'd for my friends. And so this has been a big learning experience for me. When you DM for so many fantastic people from such a wide variety of backgrounds, you get to experience so many different viewpoints on TTRPGs and how to play D&D, different play styles, different preferences, and more. And I think that's great. Whether it's like me as a DM or just playing, if you have a chance to play a one-shot or a mini campaign or even a full campaign or some sort of TTRPG experience with people that are not in your normal friend group, I highly recommend it if you have the chance. We get in a rut sometimes, right? And we forget that every player is different. Every table is different. And even though we know it's not accurate, at a subconscious level, we begin to assume that every group plays D&D the same way that our home group does. And whenever we get together with other people, we get a little shell-shocked at first because we're like, this isn't how we play Dungeons & Dragons. Because we've just forgotten the fact that every group is different. Every table is different. We can't let ourselves slip into the mindset that our group has a monopoly on the way to play Dungeons & Dragons or any role-playing game. And being a part of an experience like this, again, even if it's just something short, just like a one-shot, is an important exercise to be humble and to realize that we don't have all the answers, and to realize that just because we have certain ways that we like to do things, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best way, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. It's great to get those different perspectives. It can really grow us and help us to have better TTRPG experiences and even improve our own group. And even if we don't change anything about our group at all from those type of experiences, it still humbles us and prevents us from being haughty and helps stave away that, again, subconscious mindset that we haughtily sometimes get, where we think that we have all the answers and all the correct ways of doing things. It's important to always learn. And I'm constantly learning. This podcast and Plot Hook's Adventures has taught me so much. Being able to interact with different creators, whether it be the ones that I've had physically on the podcast, or whether it be just talking about different things with different creators, it's taught me a lot. And being willing to learn is a skill which is necessary for us to cultivate, not only in a TTRPG setting, but just in life. And so I want to talk briefly about 3 really beneficial things that I found come with interacting in one-shots or different short sessions like that for our own sessions and games. The first is that we get to understand and appreciate how different people play the game. And I touched a little bit on this already, but whenever you interact with so many people, so many different people, you gain a much richer appreciation for the aspects of role-playing games that you might not have ever considered before. We gotta think, this isn't a board game. In a board game, there might be some house rules or some variations in how different things are implemented, or if there's a question about the rules, maybe one group rules it this way, one group rules the other way, but it's a board game. It's the same game with whoever you play it with. It doesn't vary that much. But Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop role-playing games in general are different. In a sense, they are just rule sets for people to use to play whatever game they want. The same rule set, Dungeons & Dragons, can be used to tell a high fantasy story or a modern story set in Chicago with magic and horror and different things like that. It's a rule set which helps people play whatever game they want. And some people have different emphases. Some people love combat. Some people love the role-playing aspect, some people love puzzles, and there's all sorts of different preferences and areas of enjoyment. And that's great. And by interacting in these short little ways, like one-shots, we get to really understand and appreciate how different people play the game. It helps grow our own experiences, and that can really benefit not only our games, but just our interactions with other people. Whenever we see people online talking about how they handle their particular games, we can empathize more with them. We can understand more of where they're coming from. And again, appreciate how they play the game. The second really beneficial thing I found from playing in Plothook's adventures and interacting with all these great content creators is that we learn things that we enjoy that we can incorporate into our games. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have all the answers. And there's way more things that other people have thought of than just me, myself. And seeing how different people handle things, whether it be an individual handling the way they develop their backstory, or handling how they fill out their character sheet, or handling how they roleplay, or how they make rulings on a certain aspect, or different variations that they play. We can learn all these things and then incorporate it into our games. There's so many great ideas out there. The rule set of Dungeons & Dragons has so much potential for creation. Just look at the things that are all over the DM's Guild. Look at the things which I've created. And we're not even close to scratching the surface of the potential that exists. Because it's just the potential of our imagination. So that's a second thing that is really beneficial. The third really beneficial thing is you can learn ways of being more sensitive to different people's TTRPG perspectives. Just like I mentioned earlier, you can appreciate how different people play the games. You can look at how different people have different ideas and find that you enjoy them and then incorporate it into your games. And all of that helps you be more sensitive to other people's perspectives. And it helps you be more sensitive to how they handle certain things, because not all people are like ourselves. And I want to split this last point into 3 different points. And these are really some of the meat of what I learned as I was going through this process. The first is to be sensitive to how players receive information. As we're doing these one-shots set in the Plothook's world of Carrick, most of the people who are appearing on these one-shots have not read any of the material about Carrick yet. And so there's this vast, big world that I'm plopping them down into, and we have to figure out how they can best get up to speed, what information is necessary, what information is too much and would overload them, but what information do they have to have in order to feel like they're really in the environment and feel like they can role play to the best of their ability. And different players receive that information differently. Some people can process a lot of information. Some people don't want to process a lot of information and can just do a lot of things on the fly. Some people need all that sort of stuff up front. No approach is bad, but everybody is different. And as DMs, we have to be sensitive to how our players receive information. Even within our own home groups, not all of our players receive information the same way. Sending out a group Facebook message might not have the same impact on your cleric as it does on the bard. Again, not because the cleric or the bard are doing anything wrong, but just because they're different. This is all part of the communication aspect, which is so integral to playing tabletop role-playing games. We need to communicate with each other in order to make sure that we are being sensitive to each other about how each one of us receives information best. because there is a lot of information that's passed back and forth. We throw in backstories, throw in abilities, throw in new ideas, throw in new lore, dropping hints, doing whispers. So much stuff is thrown around, and in order for us to minimize the chances of stuff being lost or stuff just not being enjoyed because it's not being transmitted in the right way, we have to make sure that we are communicating in the way that's best for that individual person. The second aspect of this is to be sensitive to how players handle when their character is not involved in a scene. Even among just a home group, there are differences between players in how they handle when they're not in the scene. From the person that is so completely entranced with what's going on that they're hanging on every word, to the person who immediately struggles with checking out and looking at their phone. Again, neither one is wrong. Whatever is beneficial for the player at that particular table is perfectly fine with me. But we have to be sensitive as DMs to how players handle when they're not involved in a scene. Sometimes a player will go off and do something, and there'll be a couple of players who are left just in the lurch for a while. And especially in one-shots, that's hard to manage, because you only have so long with this group of people, and now there's some people who just aren't getting the chance to play. And we have to be sensitive to how each individual person handles this, and what we can do for them to keep them engaged. Do we need to hop back and forth between characters? Do we need to communicate with them actively during the game? There's any number of different potential solutions, and I don't pretend to know anywhere close to all of them. But again, this point is about being sensitive, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this, because each person is different. So we have to be sensitive to each person. And the third and final piece is to be sensitive to the depth at which each player likes to fill out their backstory. Some people don't like a detailed backstory. Some people like to write novels. Some people, it's really helpful for them to roleplay whenever they don't have a written backstory, but they just have some points that they are going to highlight and undergo, and then the rest is just going to come as they roleplay. They feel it gives them freedom and really helps them create on the fly. Some people feel that having a really rigid and set backstory actually helps them create because that helps them determine how they should act in a certain scenario. And there's all sorts of levels of depth in between, from really detailed building up just the last few weeks leading up to the adventure to a life story, to just jotting down some major life events that have happened over the last 70 years or however long this player character has been alive. But different players want to delve into their backstory at different lengths. And again, we have to be sensitive to that. And there's lots more things I have learned from Plothook's adventures, but these things I really wanted to highlight, that DMing or just playing with people that aren't our normal friend groups can do these three really beneficial things. It can help us understand and appreciate how different people play games. We can learn things which we can incorporate into our games, and we can learn things about being more sensitive, and that includes being sensitive to how players receive information, how players handle when their character's not involved in a scene, and how deep the player wants to delve into their backstory. So again, I really want to encourage you, if you have the opportunity to just be in a one-shot, if you feel comfortable with it, go for it. And seek to learn. We're all learning. This podcast has never been meant as something that presents hard and fast rules. We just want to start the discussion and help different people find the ways that they tell collaborative stories best. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, and we're all always learning. But I think that about wraps up the prime material for today. Let's head over to the wilds and look at something a little strange. Ugh. right, we're out here in the wilderness. Today, we want to look at the crawling claw. At first glance, this isn't really much to look at. It's just an animated dead hand crawling around on its own. Really creepy. Great to use for horror. In fact, you may or may not see it in an upcoming episode of Plothook's Adventures. But when you delve into the lore behind it, there's lots of really fascinating things about the crawling claw, because it's not just any hand that a wizard has just cast a necromantic spell on. No, they're the severed hands of murderers that are animated so that they can go on killing. And different evil arcane practitioners will actually create these and use them as extra hands to help them with their work. And this is such a dark twist on something which is almost lovably macabre, with just a silly looking hand just running around, which, in fairness, is not going to pose any threat to anybody. It's only got 2 hit points and an AC of 12. It's a challenge rating 0. It's more so just there for the horror factor. But these sinister origins create a whole new layer. Of course, you can just use it as just a random thing coming around a corner in some sort of horror setting without any additional lore attached to it. But if you want to delve into the lore, you'll get some pretty creepy stories. The soul, the life force of that murderer is bound to its hand, which animates it through the power of these dark rites of necromancy. And this can't happen if the murderer has already been raised back to life, or if the spirit has already passed on to another plane, or if the dead murderer's spirit is already manifesting as another undead creature. But, interestingly, if the severed hand of a murderer that is still alive is subjected to these rites, then the ritual binds the claw to the soul of the still living murderer. And that allows just this decaying and disgusting hand to return to its former arm and knit itself to the still living flesh from which it was cut. This would be an interesting fatal flaw, like we talked about a few episodes ago, for your villain. Because if this happens, and then that hand is once again severed, it actually puts the living murderer unconscious. That can be a real interesting fatal flaw to put in for a creature which is too hard for the party to actually beat, but then they can figure out through some means that cutting off of this individual's hand will actually render them incapacitated. Furthermore, destroying the claw in this case actually just kills the murderer. I also just love this aspect that a crawling claw can be just used by a wizard as an extra hand. That this dark lich or necromancer or just evil wizard is walking around with these hands following behind him, acting as literal extra hands to do his dirty work. That's a really interesting flavor and can add some humor to an otherwise really dark scene. You could also just have the claw go on its own volition. Perhaps the person that animated it passed away, and now it has no purpose in life. And according to the Monster Manual, which, by the way, is where you can find the crawling claw on page 44, the crawling claw will just go about doing the same things that it did in life, in other words, murdering, until it is finally slain. And there's nothing which even says that this claw even has to be a claw. It can be a foot. If you're just using it in the capacity of a horror element where there's no lore attached to it, it's just a disembodied limb hopping around, then why not make a few of the ones attacking the party feet? That makes it all the more creepy and sinister. So whether you use them just as a creepy little horror element, or as a larger element to a story, or as a fatal flaw for your creatures, there's really a lot more to the crawling claw than meets the eye. But I think that's about enough time out here with the crawling hand, let's head back over to the tavern and get some refreshment. Alright, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if you were beset by pirates? Now, this seems a little random. Why is this our plot hook for the day? Well, that's because the air date of this particular podcast is International Talk Like a Pirate Day.
Arg, and pirates be a fascinating aspect to throw at the party.
My pirate voice is pretty bad. But, legitimately, they may be very popular, but pirates really are really cool. Even if you do it in just the basic classic tropes, peg leg, eye patch, parrots, hats, skull and crossbones, those are still a blast, even though they're overplayed and not even really true to history, I don't think. They're still a blast. Pirates are just something that is just fascinating to us for some particular reason. But you can do it in a really creative way, too. And either way, pirates are a great encounter to throw at a party while they're at sea. Let's face it, there's a lot less random encounter possibility out on the ocean than there is whenever you're on land. In the ocean, you only really have three options. You're either going to come across another ship, you're going to come across something in the sea, or you're going to come across another landmass. Really the only three options that you have. Now there's lots that you can do with those particular options, but whenever you look at the specific ship thing, either you're coming across a merchant ship which can trade for the party, or a ship fleeing from a particular area, cluing the party into perhaps a part of the plot, but pirates are a big aspect of that. Especially if the party is hanging around a particular port which is known for its merchant vessels. Pirates would frequent those kinds of waters. But there's numerous ways to incorporate it. The crew can be on open waters and just encounter a ship on the horizon. And then they see the skull and crossbones, and then they have time as they see it, and it begins pursuing them, and they have to try to outrun it, and it becomes a skill challenge, and it becomes a challenge where they're trying to prepare for something instead of just straight out combat. Alternatively, they could be sailing around an island or a reef or a massive mangrove forest, some aquatic installation which blocks the view of the sailing ship. And then all of a sudden they round a bend and an ambush occurs, and out of nowhere a pirate ship sails out from behind the rocks, so to speak, and fires on them. You could have the pirates masquerading as a vessel of the military, force the party to stop, and then reveal themselves for who they really are. And of course, they don't even have to be in a ship. In Dungeons & Dragons, things fly. And you can have pirates attacking a vessel, riding on the back of winged beasts, or even merfolk or sea elves or some sort of aquatic pirate gang riding some sort of aquatic animal. There's lots of different ways you could do it, and of course, perhaps the best part is you get to use your pirate voice. But I think that's about all the time we have on this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks very much to Luna again for joining the Patreon. If you'd like to check the Patreon out yourself, it's patreon.com/plothooks. Be sure to follow us on our social media. Check out Plot Hooks Adventures this Wednesday for the finale of our second session. And as always, thanks for listening. From all of us here on the Plot Hooks team, me, Samuel, and thanks also from Matt, Mike, Dave, Steve, Zach, Becca, and podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.